Hello, my name is Paul Sandrock, ACTFL Director of Education. To support language educators at all levels as they move to teaching and learning remotely, ACTFL is very pleased to present this webinar. During this very unique situation that we are all experiencing, ACTFL thanks all of you for the tremendous and creative effort you are putting forth to support your learners. Today's webinar is led by Dr. Katy Arnett, Professor of Educational Studies at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Katy has been a high school teacher of French from beginner to advanced placement classes and has conducted extensive research in the US and Canada on inclusive teaching practices and second language development for students with language-based learning difficulties, which led to her publication, Languages for All: How to Support and Challenge Students in a Second Language Classroom. To lead today's webinar, Translating Inclusive Classroom Practices for World Language Classrooms to Remote Learning, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Katy Arnett.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure and privilege to join you this evening from my home office, seated at my beloved card catalog. As tonight unfolds and we have this unique opportunity to engage in whatever way this virtual world allows us, I draw to your attention some ways that you can do more than just sit there. Of course, as Paul mentioned, there are the chat box comments. We can engage on Twitter. I've shared my handle as well as that of ACTFL's. Feel free to tag us as well in any tweets. Personally, if you are more of a private processor, I encourage sketch notes, journaling, just reflections on your own. And for those who are used to Flipgrid and want to try that out as a platform, I've created a grid for tonight's session. There are two themes that are posted in it, one that is for general comments, and then one that is an idea about looking ahead. And as we draw the webinar to a close, that may be a place where you might want to share comments, concerns about what lies ahead and the uncertainties, and just, again, creating a different kind of community out of this experience. So like many of you, this is how I feel. This is often an analogy I use. Actually, Paul saw me use this analogy just a couple of months ago when he and I first crossed paths at the Central States Convention for Teachers of Foreign Languages right before the world shut down. And then I was sharing the fact that, normally I am a hands-on workshop kind of person. And here I am delivering a keynote that had me at standing on a podium and delivering some messages. Now I'm a fish out of water because I am theoretically teaching to 293 people right now, and I can't see a single one of you. So it is, as many of you have experienced, a bit of a jarring experience, but in the spirit of we are in this together, we are learning from each other, on we go. I begin tonight's webinar with a quote that has stayed with me for nearly 10 years. It's from a book called Intro to Disability Studies by Valen O'Connor, and it helps frame conversations about what does inclusion mean as for an educator and also for individuals with disabilities. Inclusion needs tending. It is not something we put in place, then sit back and hope for the best. It is not about a particular teacher's practice or a particular child. It is about everyone working together consciously and collaboratively toward a common goal of nurturing a vibrant, inclusive community. And that is the spirit with which I open this webinar this evening, that we are tending to the ideas of inclusion, that we are taking a moment to take stock, that we are taking a moment to acknowledge what it is we are doing, even in this very unusual time when all of our rules have been upended for what it means to deliver meaningful instruction. Throughout my conversation with you this evening, I'm going to have three touchstones. These themes are going to wind their way through various aspects of the conversation. I want to talk about barriers and what that means in the world of accessibility. And of course, the idea of access, and then what that means for inclusive practice. They are a closely intertwined trio, and without one, you can't have the others in many regards. And so it is my hope that as we have this conversation and moment of reflection, you can think about barriers, access, and inclusive practice in new or refreshed ways. So let's take a moment to think about the barriers. Prior to this webinar session, I asked folks who registered to participate in a short Google survey to help me gather some information. And what you see on the screen is a word cloud that I created in response to the second question that folks were asked to respond to. And that was, what were some of the barriers that they had encountered and difficulties they had seen emerge? The word cloud, sometimes, let's just be honest, is sometimes just a fun way to sort through all of the noise. But you can see some themes that I think are resonating with so many of us right now. Students, Wi-Fi, access, ability, able, synchronous, asynchronous, overwhelming, without, like just the way this version of the word cloud popped up, I'm like, yeah, that is it. Because so many of these words feed into the emotions and actions that we're taking on a daily basis. I looked at the data a little bit, and I call it data because it was an opportunity to learn from my audience on issues that were important to them. And I've divided the barriers as I saw them into 3 categories: BC, which now means before COVID, and we see themes that I've encountered on a variety of levels in my now nearly 20 years of research on inclusive practices. Personal and life stressors, the issues of language access and use outside of the classroom, low student motivation, limited parent support or familiarity with the language, uneven tech access for work that was happening outside just in general, managing a variety of learner needs, and to some degree having limited materials depending on the language you're teaching, the context you are teaching in. I think we can all relate to having to navigate these barriers and then others prior to the world shifting as of mid-March. Now, within this moment of COVID, DC as we say, we see barriers that we have encountered before, but they are certainly amplified and magnified in ways that we have not experienced, or they are different versions of previous stressors. I mean, the emotional labor that is being spent during this period, the uncertainty because of job loss, family shifts, lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, and all of the uncertainty and how that's fed into anxiety for not just us, but for our students, for the districts that we serve, for the schools that we support. That has been amplified. We see how the variability of tech access for students and teachers has created barriers to providing and receiving instruction. The asynchronous contact for all of us. We went into this profession for humanistic reasons. We want to be there with our students, learning along with them. And to have this disjointed reality is something that is disturbing many of us, myself included, even right now as I deliver this, because it's still weird to talk to my computer. But it's something that we are having to navigate as it happens. The fact that we have smaller windows of time to work with our students because of how our districts have responded, how our universities have responded, and the ways in which we're expected to connect with the students. Issues of platform familiarity, which is a different kind of tech access issue. It's not just hardware, but then knowing how to use the tools efficiently to get the learning. And of course, limited access to the resources and people who can help. And I think for many of us, we feel these barriers sometimes are even weightier than the barriers we encountered in the BC era, primarily because of this uncertainty and anxiety piece. And then after COVID, I think many of us are already starting to see barriers that are likely to exist. For many of us who are working on issues related to equity, we see an equity gap widening as we unfold in this situation, and that's concerning. We see how we may have a stalled growth in skills, and states and districts are trying to figure out how do we bring students back. If we can't get Maryland, there's talk of not being able to resume full-time, real-time instruction until after 2021 starts. So what does that mean for nearly a year of interrupted formal education? I mean, I also work in the world of ELs, and we talk often about students with limited or interrupted formal education who, if after the age of 7, depending on which state you're in, you have more than 6 months continuous of interrupted formal education, you are considered to be an at-risk learner. Well, we could very well be in a reality where after COVID, every child in an American school technically is a student with limited or interrupted formal education for that reason. And then what does it mean to reset back face to face? Like, there are all of these barriers, and this was in what you shared with me. This is what I've gained and gathered in my own work on issues of accessibility right now at my college, a variety of sources. Now, the reality, though, is that barriers are inevitable. Contexts create barriers. New settings, new intersections of people with those settings create barriers. It is a certainty. But what we need to do in response to the barriers is what creates the moment for inclusive practice. So if we take that action, we are being inclusive. And by consequence, if we aren't taking action, we may be perpetuating the barriers. Now, many of you are familiar perhaps with Lev Vygotsky, known to us in the world of scaffolding. Well, it wasn't him who proposed it, but those who interpreted his theory in the mid-70s. But his early work was actually focused on the educational and life experiences of children who were institutionalized for complex medical and health needs. And in his early work, he posits that disability in many ways is a social creation, that certainly there are disorders and dysfunctions that exist, and people do have difficulties, whether because of varying abilities, varying experiences, or various functions within their body. But it's how society chooses to respond or not respond that really creates the disabling condition that individual must navigate. So I share this with the spirit that that this idea of barriers being and removing barriers being a part of inclusive practice is one that is long proposed, and might introduce you to another interpretation of Vygotsky. Now, moving forward, I think the question we have in front of ourselves, and that is, where we are at with the conversation for tonight's webinar, is how do we limit or remove the barriers and facilitate inclusive practice? So I want to start by how we are aware of our mindsets, our beliefs, and our attitudes, because we know from a clear thread of research that has existed now for decades that beliefs influence actions. So if we really want to understand where we are and are not taking action, we need to be mindful of the mindsets that we are bringing to the work. Now, I'm going to talk broadly about an approach to action that I hope and would expect that many of you would be familiar with by now, and I'm going to intersect that with some conversations around disability, and then bring that into conversation with what is happening in the world of language teaching. So the images are going to be important. So Carol Dweck's work that really launched onto the scene after about 20 years of research came in 2010 with her book Mindset, and introduced the popular world to the notion of the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. In short, the growth mindset is that if you believe in the possibility that you can change, that you are going to take action to support those changes. Like, if you think you are capable of getting better at something, you are more likely to work at getting better at that. Conversely, if you hold a fixed mindset, you might be stuck in the concrete, you might have a limited belief, or a belief that you are limited on what you are capable of changing within yourself or perhaps others. And as a result, you are going to engage in actions that perpetuate that stasis, that are not going to cause change of any way. What is important to acknowledge in Dweck's work is that an individual can hold a fixed mindset about one area of their life, but a growth mindset about others. It is not that people fall in camps of being a growth-oriented person or a fixed-oriented person. We are mixed in all areas of our lives. Now, I want to take that broader mindset and now look at that in relation to what we know about interaction. And I'm going to draw on some research now that's nearly 20 years old, but was seminal in the way that it helped us think about what happened in classrooms related to inclusive practice. So the work of Ann Jordan and Paula Stanovich, and others, that was framed out of Canada, it was in the Ontario region, was specifically looking at teachers and how they interacted with students in the classroom based on the teachers' perceptions of the students and the teachers' perception of their ability to respond to student needs. And in their research, they developed an understanding of what they framed as the interventionist mindset, that if a teacher held the belief that they were capable of helping a student grow, that their actions as a teacher could help the student be more successful, and particularly if that student was an IEP carrier, or they don't have 504s in Canada, but it's the same comparable idea. Those teachers would engage in the types of interactions that would help the student grow in the classroom. They would engage in academically oriented interactions. They would do less classroom management of the students and their behavior, even for the students who were problem children. And I use that in air quotes with, not my terminology, but that of the teachers. And similarly, teachers who held what is called a pathognomonic perspective, and there's a good word for you for conversation at cocktail parties. Pathognomonic perspective is another way of saying that this is a very medicalized, deficit-oriented view of the child, and that the disability and deficit that the child has is so permanent and unresponsive to change that the teacher has no capacity, or believes they have no capacity, to help this student grow for whatever reason, whether behaviorally, academically, socially. It's just not there. And what they saw in their research time and time again, the teacher was a pathognomonic view holder. They interacted with these students less in the classroom. They avoided them. There were fewer interactions with the students, between the students and teachers altogether. So just want to pause and let you sit with that for just a moment. Yeah, so actions, beliefs, influencing our actions for good and bad in the classroom. Now, in this moment, and even when our sense of efficacy as teachers has been totally robbed, we have to recognize that every opportunity we have to be with students, to engage with a student, even though it's a different way that we've engaged with them, is still an opportunity to promote the growth. It might not be growth at the same rate and with the same skills that we were working at prior to COVID, but inclusion now has to look different because our context is different, our goals are different, our needs are different. And wherever we have an opportunity to have an interaction, and that interaction is about removing a barrier, then we are choosing that moment to facilitate growth. And it might relate to the whole idea of the can-do. I mean, I know, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek that I say this. That's also with a little bit of seriousness. The can-do statements have been a foundational bedrock, not just of what ACTFL has done in the last decade of its work, but then also what we've seen out of the Council of Europe, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, and how that translated into use worldwide. But the can-do spirit and how that is intersected in language world to be like, I'm working at this, I'm getting better. That proficiency is built from the ground up. When we opted into the can-do movement and the can-do framing of what goes on for language instruction, we started to define proficiency by what we could do, and instead of what we had done previously was define what somebody lacked in relation to a native speaker. And that upending of how we have framed the language growth is a powerful asset for us right now in this very unique world. The can-do philosophy, the can-do structure, the theory of can-do is really about letting students take autonomy and personalize their learning and move forward. And now more than ever, we are seeing personal contexts reign supreme in how we are able to respond to learner needs. So let's take a look at what inclusive practice can look like in remote learning. Broadly, as I was saying earlier, we need to meet students where they are, and where they are is more different and more varied than what we have experienced previously. And sometimes that challenge is because of our own access to technology, or the kinds of resources we've been given, or the kinds of expectations we've been given about how we meet them. I've intersected with many families who are concerned about how IEPs and 504s are being supported in this remote era. There's still an expectation that they are supported, but but in addition, we also have these personal contexts with, massive job loss, food insecurity, a lot of equity gaps being widened because of how this has been handled in a variety of states and at the federal level. And we can see different ways in which the students are being impacted. So now more than ever, we need to take stock of where each student individually is, provided we can find them. Because I think we know we've all lost some students in this process, and that's also been very unsettling. The other reality is that to be inclusive in this world of remote learning, we have to expand the toolbox. And I've used this analogy in other work that I've done, that really inclusive practice is about adding tools and using them discreetly and judiciously when you need to. So again, I returned to the survey that I asked folks to complete prior to the session this evening. I had about 55 folks reply by the time it was all said and done. And I spent some time this afternoon cleaning up and organizing the data. And you can see here are the 6 tools that were most commonly reported as being used by the teachers. Now, they could list as many tools as they wanted, but you see that the G Suite, Google's takeover of the American classroom, seems to be complete in many areas. But we also had interesting, Zoom is there, Flipgrid, which I think has really expanded its footprint in this remote world. Nearpod and Pear Deck, both of my nieces have been doing lessons there. But you can see just the smattering, and there were 27 unique tools. Like once I got out of the categories, there were 27 categories across just 54 teachers of tools that were being used. So to me, that's a pretty impressive ratio of tools that are different and being used across teachers and contexts. So providing support is inclusive. And what you see on the screen now is a summary of some of the ways that you have chosen to provide support to your students right now. And I want to say that in taking these actions, what you have done is to try to mitigate a barrier. So that is inclusive learning, and that is inclusive teaching. Flexibility was the most commonly used word in this part of the survey. I think all but 5 people included flexibility or flexible in their response in some way, shape, or form, whether it be with deadlines for assignments or how formats for submitting work, or the content they focused on, attendance, screen time, wherever choice could be offered, choice was being offered. That said, there were also times when a one-off solution was required for a student because of their particular circumstances. And if that custom solution is being offered for that student, that is inclusive practice, because you are trying to mitigate barriers that are specific to them. Meetings, I think as much as we have tried to be available for students to find us, I think more of us are trying other tools to reach out to families and connect with them. I mean, I'm not totally on social media, but I do have a fair bit of tools that my students that I've taught have historically been able to use to track me down. And even in this remote period, I added 2 more because I didn't feel like I had enough options since they couldn't come track me down in my office. Increased communication, because the information flow is a way that we try to limit some of the equity gaps. We see when we don't have access to information how that actually makes certain challenges persist. So the more that we can get information in the hands of decision makers, whether they be parents, our supervisors, our students themselves, that has been helpful. And there's been a strong attention to the fact that we have an emotional moment that we are living right now. We all have a shared anxiety and a concern about how things are going. There are a greater range of emotions in a very compressed period, and folks are responding to that as well. And at this point, I'm going to pause because I know Paul would like to throw in some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katy. These are very helpful, specific suggestions. And we hear a lot from educators that they're concerned about keeping students motivated, especially during this time of remote learning. Could you offer some suggestions maybe to address that idea of motivation, keeping learners engaged? So many schools have removed some of that external accountability like assessments or grades.
Yeah, for sure.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So motivation in our pre-COVID world was already a very thorny topic to navigate at times, and the balance of the intrinsic versus the extrinsic versus the self-determined. There were a lot of factors, and I always think of the work of Zoltan Dornier out of the UK on 20, 30 years of great research on motivation in the second language classroom. And what we are experiencing right now is remote learning, which is not online learning. So I think in some ways, Paul, the answer starts with taking a broader view, that we all have to recognize that everyone's motivation right now is impacted, not just our students, but ourselves. We are all carrying an emotional burden around this period and the uncertainty that it's created and the ways it has upended what we consider to be our normal lives. And I can admit to having motivational challenges. There are days when it's like, wow, it is really hard to, keep going into this one space and not really interacting with people in the same way that I have before, to problem solve, to be inspired, to keep me accountable in different ways. So I think it's recognizing that we should be using, recognizing that motivation needs to come in other forms and might be from other sources, that motivation right now is a variable that we can't necessarily control. But I think making space for people to acknowledge that they are having a hard time with it is a way to support motivation. I think of a handful of students within the last week who have reached out to the office that I work with at St. Mary's and have said, I just tanked once we went remote. I lost all interest in doing my schoolwork because I had to return home to this chaotic situation. And then I had this issue, and then also, how I learn is not conducive with how screens were. And so I just totally gave up because I didn't see a path forward. And sometimes I think acknowledging that the lack of motivation is sometimes because we have a lack of vision. And I don't mean that in a slight against us in any way, shape, or form. We are all living through something that 99.99% of the world could not relate to previously with the way we have restructured our daily lives. And because we are all fish out of water, we have to reset and figure out new paths forward. Some of us have an easier time with that kind of troubleshooting than others. So I think sometimes the answer to motivation is we need to go a little bit easier on ourselves, especially right now.
Great, thank you so much. And there was one other question about the tools that you are talking about. They are applicable to languages, but most of them have not come specifically they were not developed specifically only for language use. Would that be accurate?
That is correct. So I want to, when we are talking about inclusive practice, so I'll detour a bit into how I first became involved in this work. It was, admittedly as an undergraduate, when I was doing some tutoring of some students on campus who had language-based learning difficulties, but still needed to pass our college's foreign language requirement for graduation. And I was eventually the tutor of the French department, but I initially got tapped on the shoulder because they thought, well, you're going to be a teacher and you like French, so you can figure this out. And very early on, one of the things that I did was, I started looking up, well, what does inclusion look like in language classrooms? And I didn't find a lot. But then I looked up, well, what is inclusive practice? And then what is best practice in language classrooms? And even then, and this is, late 90s, early 2000s, there was overlap in the world of what is inclusive practice and best practices for language education. And that's been the anchor to my inquiries ever since. And my reference to Vygotsky earlier was very deliberate, because in the world of language teaching, there are various theories for folks to use to organize how they think language proficiency develops. And Vygotsky's work is a prominent theory. Sociocultural theory, SCT, is one of the strands in second language development research. It is also, because of Vygotsky's origins, well-founded in the world of disability studies and inclusive practice. So we see both of those lenses existing in that world. And my doctoral research was the first study that we could find that married the use of Vygotsky for those purposes. So while we still don't have a large corpus of research on inclusive practices in world languages, because let's be honest, for many years it has been a conversation about how language programs can or should be for more academically oriented students who are university bound and or do not have IEPs and 504s. I mean, that is a part of our heritage as language educators that we do need to confront. But all the while we've had a core base of practices that, you know, put an IEP in the hands of any world language teacher in the US or Canada, and I guarantee they're going to be able to find strategies in that IEP that line up with what they are doing on a daily basis to promote language development. So hopefully that addresses the question that was posed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, so are we ready to move forward? All right, so at this time, I want to just take a few moments to share some more tools for the toolbox. And my suggestions for the toolbox are shaped by some of the information that was shared in that survey that participants completed in advance. I'm suggesting here the Google, this is a plugin for Google Chrome. It is text help. It is known as Read and Write. It is a free tool that does text to speech reading, and you can use it. It works great in Google Docs, it works great in Google Slides, it works great with PDFs that folks are using. There's a free version, there is a paid version that is a couple of dollars should families or students individually want to invest in that if they need a more robust support. But Read and Write, this software exists for multiple languages. Last I checked, there was, you know, French, Spanish, Dutch, and there was Russian may have been one of them. But there are multiple languages that are supported. It does highlighting, it does annotation. And if you have students who are using a screen, or you yourself are spending more time in front of a screen, like right now when it came to, you know, reviewing student papers, I popped all of them into this software so that they could be read to me, because my eyes have become so fatigued by being on a screen even more than I have been before. Another suggestion in the G Suite is to use the voice typing feature in Google Docs. It's under the Tools menu, and it is, again, a multilingual tool in the G Suite. It's the option for voice typing is about 2/3 of the way down. A little microphone icon appears, and on that microphone icon is a little arrow drop down that you can use to select the language of choice. Now, it is not a fully accurate system, and you certainly have to pay attention to dictation, and you have to pay attention, punctuation and capitalization. But this could be a task that for students who have access to this kind of resource, they could voice type a response, and their assignment then is to correct their voice type edits so that you can see what they dictated and then what the software generated, and then a corrected version of that would be in the target language that's there. But this, for me, also is a tool that I've used on the teaching side of things to create quick transcripts of videos for accessibility reasons, where I can play a video, have this going in the background, and have that captured, and I go in and do some edits. Now, I can only do that for about 1 or 2 minute video clips, but that certainly is another way that we're supporting access for our students right now. This feature, then the multilingual functioning, will also work in Google Slides. Now, again, with the G Suite, you see on the screen a screen grab from a screencast that I did using Google Slides. And within Google Slides, you can upload something from PowerPoint, Keynote, Google Slides. Admittedly, I've not tried it. Like if you've created a slide deck in say something like Nearpod or Pear Deck, and you're using their proprietary formats, and it does not work with Canva-based slides, but because they export as PDFs, so that's part of the challenge, at least with the free version of Canva. But you can upload to Google Slides. You go into present mode, and then your toolbar appears, and then you click close captioning. and you turn it on and you start talking, and it narrates it. It's the same technology that's used for captioning in YouTube videos, and it creates approximate captioning, not accurate captioning, and that is an important distinction in the world of ADA and accessibility. But so long as you give the caveat that you are providing this as a universal design, unless of course there's a student with an IEP who has this as a need, you really do need to have the accurate captioning. There isn't a way to edit it, but you marry Google Slides, and I did the screencast. I personally use Snagit, which is part of the Camtasia and Jing family, but I've also hacked it in Zoom as another one. Screencastify for a paid version, you can, and Screencast-O-Matic, you can do some captioning as well. Now, and this is just another activity idea that I'm going to bring to folks. It's not a tool per se, but rather a way of designing instruction. When the internet started to become a thing, and there were ideas around, how do we use this as a teaching tool? There was, this big flurry of activity on web quests. And, once the world of G Suite kind of took hold and other technology tools were available, a web quest has fallen out of use because there are other things to consider. But this might be an opportunity to bring back a web quest or make a hybrid web quest. What you see on the screen here is actually one that my students created this past summer when I was teaching a course on technology in the classroom. And they had a bit of back and forth with me about the relevance of making a web quest, because they're like, oh, when are we going to have to, when would our students need to do something like this? Well, lo and behold, all of my students have since deployed the web quests officially that they created in the summer, because they did this great thing on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, yes, I'm not teaching language classes at the moment, but I have seen web quests that are for language students. And there are lots of different ways to organize web quests, but if you do a quick Google search, you'll find ways to set them up. These web quests were created using Google Sites and embed the tools, the docs and the slides, and you can bring in YouTube and all of these other great tools to create an asynchronous learning event that is a little bit more structured and allow students to work individually and or in groups as needed to create a learning goal.
And if I might just interrupt a moment here, Katy.
Yes.
There have been some very specific questions related to some of the technology that you've been sharing.
Sure.
And some are related to the captioning in Google Slides, options in PowerPoint. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about some of your preferences, and this is just your personal preference,
Yeah.
but it's your experience that people are asking for.
For sure.
So, for you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So one of the things I have very much appreciated about the last couple of years is how Microsoft has really upped its game. And Microsoft 2019 now has the ability to, you could do it a little bit with some clunkiness in like the 2015, 2016 versions of PowerPoint, but now as of 2019, you can record a screencast within PowerPoint and use that as a tool, but it doesn't do the captioning piece as easily. There was a hack that somebody told me that of a way to do it, but admittedly, I haven't tried it, but it's out there. Microsoft has really upped its game with accessibility. I love how now within PowerPoint, it will auto-generate alt text for images, which is an important consideration for screen reader technology. So I've been really impressed by what Microsoft has to offer, and I do need to do a little bit more hands-on practice with it. I have gone with the G Suite hack myself because my college we are a G Suite school. It is also, G Suite is used by the school district in which all of my teacher interns go, so there's another reason there. In the real-time use of Google captioning, one of the things that my students and I have tested as part of this is it auto edits out swear words and words that might be found to be offensive. So we tested this out. I knew what was going to happen, but I pulled up a slideshow, turned on the captioning, and then insisted that my students start yelling out like they were being disruptive students and who might be trying to make the screen show bad words, and they couldn't make the screen show bad words. So from the standpoint that we are all trying to fly by the seat of our pants right now, or not try, well, we are flying by the seat of our pants right now. The fact that that filter was built in on Google, and gives me some comfort in using it as approximate captioning. But when I am creating a video that is for the purpose of delivering instruction and I need to use accurate captioning, I am going with a service like Rev, and there are plenty others out there, Crash and Associates, for example, that do offer specific captioning. And I know Zoom has a plugin that some of the remote AI-assisted support softwares for captioning can use. But I don't mind Google. I wish it could give you a little bit more of a screen view. It gives you 2 lines at a time. And I wish it would create a transcript. Like one day, and I put this into the Google developers regularly, between how everything works in their cloud, it seems to me that these captions could be dumped into a transcript. So that is one thing they don't do, but it's still a great accessibility tool.
Very good, very good. There's 2 other comments that are related to your comments about communication with students and the need to reach out. And one comment is that sometimes students are feeling almost bombarded with the contact, so many messages coming in, so many ways trying to reach them. How do you get that careful balance between I'm paying attention, but I don't want to overwhelm you? And
right.
Also related to that, a comment about many students seem to have almost just disappeared, and they just are not participating. Again, any strategies, that delicate balance of communication and concern without harassment.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is a challenge I've navigated personally and professionally right now as we have shifted our remote instruction. And I don't hold up that I have the answer, but in terms of what my experiences have been with students, early on in our shift to remote delivery as a college, we put together what we called the Day 1 survey that we deployed to our campus after the first 24 hours of remote instruction, before we knew we were going to be remote for the whole semester. But at that point, we had about a 75% inkling that it was going to have to be more than the 2 weeks we had initially shared with our students. And one of the questions asked the students, how much do you want to hear from us? And and who do you want to hear from? What is helpful and what is not? So our institutional response was customized to that survey that had about a 30% response rate, which is typical for surveys. I mean, we knew we weren't going to reach everyone because heck, only 30% chose to respond. But it was also, there were certainly students who I work with who were overwhelmed and completely, shut down with the remote learning, either because of, mental health related reasons. Several of my students who were on the autism spectrum really struggled because of the abrupt change to their routines and systems and ways of learning that they weren't quite used to. Where we could, we deployed different strategies. I created our first Remind class for an office on our campus and invited directly with the cell numbers that I had from student records, all of the students. We didn't have every student join. In fact, I only had 3 join, but 2 of them who joined hadn't reached out to our office otherwise. One of them was telling us, oh, by the way, as all of this is going on, I'm now socially transitioning and this is my new name and these are some of the things that are going on in my life. And then another student was joining us by Remind because it was an app they were familiar with from high school, and it was suddenly comforting for them to be communicating with us that way. So even if the tools aren't getting everyone on board, the fact that I was just trying all of these different ways, we've set up accounts with Ring Central, and we created an internal Google site that we sent it to all of the students. And, where we could, we intersected with our instructors who were meeting with our students synchronously to have class announcements to make sure that they were aware of the resources, because our instructors really were there for the contact. And then the other piece of, losing track of the students. I mean, that has been hard. I mean, there are some students right now whose radio silence weighs heavily on my heart and teaching spirit, because I genuinely worry for them. And I knew that they were already in vulnerable situations as students on our campus, and, vulnerable situations in their home lives. And to have that then intersect, where I could, I've used my Ring Central account, which, if you're not familiar, is allows you to text from a number and call from a number that is not your personal cell number, if you're trying to protect some level of privacy on your own information. And for some of those students, I reached out via text, and 5 students came that way. So it's really, for me, it's not about it's coming to accept that all of us have been deeply impacted by this in ways we cannot always begin to fathom. And, where I can do things that I have control for, like setting up more tools and pushing them out in ways that I think students may reach, and trying that out, that's how I've been persisting.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. All right. So with that, I just have a couple of closing remarks. And, when Paul asked me to share this webinar, he asked that I speak on a theme comparable to how I had done this keynote at CSC TFL in March. And recognizing that we are already doing inclusive practices. And that was coming through in the questionnaire that I put out to folks prior to this. You are doing it. We have the knowledge, we have the skills. World language teachers are the best MacGyvers, and I hope most of you still get that reference, of the school, because we have often had to make a lot out of nothing. We have sometimes been the least resourced, least understood programs behind PE, behind art, because in America, the notion of multilingualism hasn't always been validated in the ways that we would hope it would be. And because of that, we are super creative individuals. Like, I am sitting at my card catalog right now that has all sorts of drawers full of index cards, to paper clips, to anything that I could possibly use in a creative way to get students talking French. And in the time that I've taught ESL as well, getting them to work with the weirdest language on the planet.
Great, great, great. Thanks, Katy. No, I appreciate your, did you have anything else to say?
Well, I just looking at the last questions, there was a question about the app used to contact students via text or phone where your number remains anonymous. You can do it 2 ways. Remind is an app that I've used regularly. It's been around for several years now. You can create classes and send out specific class messages. You can have one-on-one. I know Dojo, Class Dojo, is very popular in the elementary, middle school realm. Ring Central, it's one of the business platforms that's out there for folks. It's actually was like for Salesforces, who were using their personal cell phone but had to operate as a business. So that is another option.
That is fantastic.
Yes.
And thank you so much. And I think most of the other comments are just great words of thanks, to which I will add my own as well, Katy. You have done such a phenomenal job of giving us some great ideas. I'm just reflecting on the idea of can do, and how you use that as a way to link us with our focus on language proficiency, but also on our focus on our learners. That whole idea of autonomy, the definition of needing to focus on that growth mindset, and that our actions facilitate the learning. So thank you for that reframing of can do. That's going to stick with me a long, long, long time.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank everyone else. I've seen some notifications come in on Twitter. Down here at the bottom, you have seen the place for Flipgrid. I will pop in and add, to some responses there if folks would like to continue the conversation, particularly in the chat about what lies ahead, the idea of looking ahead, because this is something I think we can all share information with each other and try to, just use our teacher superpowers of creative brainstorming. to keep
Absolutely,
everything moving
absolutely.
forward.
Well, our thanks go to you, and our thanks also go out to all of the language educators who have participated in tonight's webinar. We thank you for all you are doing for your learners today, every day. You know that they appreciate your care and your concern for their well-being, as well as for the development of proficiency in a second language, that amazing gift that you are helping facilitate for them. Please continue to visit our website, www.actful.org. Thank you for learning with Actful.
Thank you all. Good evening.